Tonight, a look at our country's immigration battle in ways you probably haven't seen before. Thousands upon thousands of children from Central America running across the border alone. Once they touch U.S. soil, they are held for days at detention centers that are struggling to keep up with the surge. Well, tonight, we'll hear from a local immigration attorney and an immigration advocate who say that this isn't just a challenge out west, this is hitting very close to home. And as the 50th anniversary of the historic Freedom Summer of 1964 nears, we pay tribute to those who risked and lost their lives in the fight for equality, including one of Westchester's own. Filmmaker Stanley Nelson speaks to RFL about his new PBS documentary, Freedom Summer. And the heroin epidemic that we have covered countless times in this program takes center stage at a conference of New England governors where they say it has reached epidemic proportions. Connecticut Governor Daniel Malloy, he'll join us on RFL talking about the growing crisis in his state and what he and other New England governors plan to do about it. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Those subjects and much more, including news coming out of Albany, coming up this hour. Thank you very much for joining us. And we begin this evening with a look at the nation's immigration debate like you've never seen it before. Federal authorities say that children, many who are from Central America, they're crossing the U.S. border and crossing alone without any adult. Authorities say many of the children who are from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador leave their home countries because of violence and pressure to join gangs, while others race towards the U.S. to improve their quality of life and even reunite with other relatives already here. The children who make it across the border, they're held for 72 hours at detention centers in the U.S. that say they're having trouble keeping up with the rising demand. Now, the majority of the detention centers or shelters, they're near the Mexico border. Obama administration has opened emergency shelters on military bases. Think about that, in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. Two other emergency shelters are located in New York State.
I'm a little appalled at seeing this, the way they're holding like they're prisoners or not prisoners, children.
Undeniably, there is a problem of humanitarian proportions in the Rio Grande Valley sector that we must deal with.
Now, once the children leave the detention facilities, they are put in the care of the Department of Health and Human Services, which provides for them until they find family members or legal guardians here in America. Now, a piece in the Times recently says that the fallout is being felt most acutely in places with large immigrant populations, like New York, where newly arrived children and their relatives are flooding community groups. And that many of the children, they face a huge amount of both stress involved with seeking help in fighting deportation orders, getting health care, dealing with the trauma of migration, and managing the challenges of family unification, as well as just basic things like even enrolling in school. Okay, let us bring in our first person for this conversation, and that is Emma Kreyche. Emma is an organizing and advocacy organizer for the Worker Justice Center of New York, and she deals with this crisis firsthand every day. She and I spoke earlier this afternoon about this very subject. People think, I think the general population, this situation, it's relegated right across the border here, so all these kids are basically either being detained or processed in Texas, but that's not the case throughout the country, including in places in the Hudson Valley where you're joining us from. You're seeing these kids, right?
We are seeing unaccompanied minors in our community here in upstate New York. So as you mentioned, a lot of these kids are being detained right at the border. They're being processed and put in removal proceedings. But once they are processed, they are put into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So they're generally put in shelters until they can be reunited with members of their family who already reside here in the United States. And that's the point at which we're starting to see these young people in our communities. So here in Kingston, we have a pretty substantial Central American community, a very vibrant immigrant community. And so a couple of months ago, I guess back in March, is when I started to see families coming in trying to figure out how to get their kids into their custody once they were processed and put in removal proceedings pending their immigration court dates. And so I I, at that time, really didn't know what to do or what to make of the situation, but I certainly, over the course of several weeks, saw a number of these cases, and I realized that there was something big going on.
Could you put a face on this? We've seen the numbers here, but give an idea of the range of ages of kids that are coming through your door here and where they're coming from.
The majority of cases I've seen have been in that high school age range, from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras primarily, which I think is in keeping with the national trends. But what we're seeing is quite unprecedented in terms of the numbers, as you mentioned, of unaccompanied minors coming over. And so it seems to indicate that there's something more going on here than the sort of traditional flow of economic migrants. But a lot of these kids are coming to us having dealt with some sort of a trauma in their home countries or in their experiences crossing the border or once they're detained. And unfortunately, in this community, it's a small community. There aren't a lot of services available that are language appropriate, that are that really have a handle on how to help these kids. So it's been a real struggle. And our organization historically hasn't provided direct immigration legal services. We work with low-wage workers who have been dealing with workplace abuses, and that's been our focus. But because we work with so many immigrant workers, the families have been coming to us because they don't know where else to turn for information about where to go and what to do and how to help their kids.
Talk about the reunifications when you can't actually place a kid with an aunt or a family member or a loved one. I mean, still, obviously, got all the language challenges. They'd be a new kid in school. They got the trauma they're dealing with from coming across, and let alone who knows what they ran into from when they left, they even got here. Talk about the challenges associated even with that.
That's the point of entry for our organization, and we're starting to see people. So once these young people are released into the custody out of these refugee shelters, they're put in the custody of these family members. Sometimes it's a parent, but often it's an uncle or a cousin or an older brother or an aunt, right? Another family member who takes custody for them, and then they have to figure out what to do in the face of the deportation proceedings that they're in. So they're looking for immigration legal services. Often they're looking for mental health services. But in this area, at least in the Mid-Hudson Valley, there is a real lack of infrastructure for this. There aren't a lot of Spanish-speaking therapists, for example, in our county. And so it's been a real challenge to connect people with those resources. One of the things that we're trying to do is really do that kind of triage, right? Try to figure out how to work with local attorneys and agencies to figure out how to meet the need that's not there.
Finally, Emma, I'm sure there's some conflicted people in the viewing audience tonight. If they could spend one day as a fly on the wall in your office, do you think at the end of that day they'd say, you know what, deport the whole bunch of them, or we got to do something for these kids? We can't just say, no room at the lodge here, go back to where you came from.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis is pretty heartbreaking. We are very accustomed, unfortunately, to seeing situations of workplace abuse where immigrant workers are taken advantage of because of their status, paid below the minimum wage, not paid overtime, suffering from various forms of discrimination, sexual harassment, abuse. So I hate to say it, but we're used to seeing that. But my experience has not been working with kids so much, with youth and with children. And so for me, as a parent, to see what these kids are going through, what their family members are going through to try to keep them safe, it has been heart-wrenching, I must say. And I do think that the majority of the American public really has no idea what these kids' experiences has been. And I think if they did really understand that and see that, that public opinion would change.
All right, when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation, and an immigration attorney, Susan Henner, will join us to discuss the social and political impacts of this border battle and the lives of the kids here. We're talking thousands and thousands of kids who are at the center of this very debate.